Welcome to this new series designed to help you to understand chords, even if they've been completely baffling to you before. In fact, especially if they have been baffling to you before. In this series, I'm going to assume that you know nothing already about chords, and that way I'll make sure that we cover everything that you need to know. And I've got some helpful resources that you can access for free over on the Saxophone Studies website. So if you're not watching this on the site already, then click on the link below this video on YouTube, and that'll take you over to the Saxophone Studies website where you can watch this video and access the resources too. So click the link below to get the best use of this lesson. Over the next 5 lessons, I'm going to go through the most commonly used types of chords that you're likely to see, explain where they come from, what their chord symbols are and what they mean, and importantly for us as saxophonists, I'll guide you through how to use them to make your solos even better. I'm Matthew Smith, I'm the founder of Saxophone Studies. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button here on YouTube, and then you will hear from me every time a new video comes out. And if you have the uncontrollable desire to show your appreciation for this lesson, then you can click on the Buy Me a Coffee link below this video to buy me a coffee. So where are chords from? Well, to answer this, I'm going to start by answering a couple of quick-fire, easy-to-answer questions. The first one is, what is a chord? A chord is when you play 3 or more notes at the same time. And where do chords come from? Well, all chords come from scales. And the major scale is the gateway to understanding scales. Everything stems from there. So we're going to start here with the major scale because it's also the gateway to understanding chords. For my examples in this lesson, I'm going to be using a G major scale for E flat instruments, so that's alto and baritone saxophones, and that gives you the C major scale for B flat instruments, so soprano and tenor. So make sure you're using the correct scale to go with your instrument. You probably know from watching my ear training series that each note within a scale can be allocated a number. You'll see on the screen now that I've also added in these numbers with the scales as well. And this is just a way of labelling the notes of the scale without having to use their letter names. The advantage of this is that I can now talk to you about the degrees of the scale, so the first or the fifth, etc. And whether you're using the G major scale or the C major scale or any other major scale, you'll know what note I mean. So talking in numbers allows us to apply ideas across lots of different keys. It just makes it easier to communicate about it. The first chord I'm going to tell you about is what's called the Tonic Triad. The punchline is that this means that you play the first, the third and the fifth notes from a scale. And when you play them simultaneously, together, you create a chord that's called the Tonic Triad. You may more commonly hear people talk about this chord, the Tonic Triad, as being chord 1, but you now know that that just means that you're starting on the first note of the scale and playing that chord, the 1, 3, 5. The Tonic Triad in a major scale creates what's called a major chord. I'll explain what that means in a minute, but first, this is what it sounds like. So that's what it sounds like, but what do those words mean? Tonic Triad. Well, in music, tonic refers to the first note or the key note of a scale. Triad means that the chord has 3 notes, hence the Tonic Triad. Now, I also said that this creates a major chord. Major means that the chord contains a major third interval. So if you start on the root note of the chord and go to the next note up in the chord, that creates the interval of a major third. And you can spot this aurally because it has a happy or a nice sound. If it were a minor chord, it'd sound a bit dark, a bit sad. It'd sound like this. But we're not talking about the minor chord, we're talking about the major chord, and it sounds like this. So we now know that a chord is when you play 3 or more notes at the same time. And we know that the Tonic Triad is a chord where you play the first, the third and the fifth notes of a scale. And this particular chord that we're looking at is the major Tonic Triad because you're starting on the first note of a major scale. And this particular chord that we're looking at now is a major chord because it contains that major third interval. So to create the chord symbol for this type of chord, you simply use the letter name of the root note. So for example, C or G. So if you ever see a chord that has a letter name, so F sharp, B, E, A, anything like that, it simply means that you start on the first note of that scale and you play the first, the third and the fifth notes of that scale, and that's how you create that chord. And what does that mean for us as saxophonists? Well, it means two things, but before I tell you about that, if you haven't already, make sure you've got your saxophone set up, because in a minute we're going to be doing some playing. As saxophonists, when we use chords, we use it to guide us in playing improvised solos. Each chord symbol is like a little piece of code, and it's got two functions. One is to tell you the notes within the chord, and the second piece of information it's giving you is what scale that chord comes from. So understanding chord symbols is really important to help you play the best sounding notes in your solos. You can of course do this by ear as well, but what I've found is that if you understand this intellectually as well as orally, then you can get to the end result a lot more quickly, which is, let's face it, what we all want to do. Right, enough talking, it's time for you to do some playing. We're going to explore this first chord a bit more, and we're going to do that through playing. So the first piece of information that this chord symbol is giving us is what the notes of the chord are, and you now know that it's telling you it's the first, third and fifth notes from that major scale. So in your solo, if you play these notes, then you're going to sound good, because these are the notes that are being played in the accompanying harmony. So in a minute we're going to try a bit of improvisation on this chord, but first let's just do a bit of technical practice. We've got the notes of the chords now, but what we're going to do is just get you familiar with playing them over your instrument, and a really good way to do that is to practice playing the chord notes in different inversions. And what this means is that for the G chord, for example, instead of just playing G, B and D, you start playing those notes from the lowest one you can. So in this case it would be a low B. So you play low B, then D, and then G, and then D, and then G, and then B, and then G, and then B, and then D, etc. And you work all the way up the instrument. If you can't get that low on your saxophone, don't worry, just start at the lowest point that you can currently on your instrument. And as I say, you're practicing your technical facility here and practicing being fluent with these notes. And the reason it's important to practice this is that when you're improvising, what we're aiming at doing is having to think as little as possible about what we need to do technically. And what that means is that we've then got as much of our brain space or brain power available to focus on being creative. So it's really important to practice the technical stuff first. On the Saxophone Studies site, below this video, you'll see, if you scroll down, there's a PDF that has this exercise written out, and it's written out for the G chord and for the C chord, so it covers both the E flat saxophones and the B flat saxophones as well. But here's just a quick example of me playing the exercise so you can hear what you're aiming at. So now we've done some preparatory work, let's try a bit of improvisation. I'm going to put on a backing track and I'm going to give an example of me improvising but only using these chord notes. Then after my example I'll leave the backing track running for a short while and then you can have a go too. And remember, you can play these three notes in any octave like you did it when you practiced the technical exercise. Just a quick note to say that in this lesson I'm focusing on the harmony that you can play, chord harmony. We're not talking about rhythm really, but rhythm is also a really important angle on improvisation. But as I say, we're just talking about the notes today. That said, here's a couple of quick pointers to help you with your improvising. So first of all, when you're playing, make sure you use space or rests, because the gaps that you leave, the spaces, frame the notes that you play. So space in your solo is really important. And secondly, play a combination of short notes and long notes. And try and vary the rhythms that you're playing. Also, you can play repeat one note. You can play repeated rhythms. So try to vary what you're playing. Don't just go up and down the arpeggio, because that'll be really dull. So you're trying to create something that sounds good, sounds musical as best you can. And if you'd like an extended go at this, and you're not already watching this on the Saxophone Studies website, click the link below, because underneath the video, again scroll down if you are on the site, underneath the video there's the backing track without my example, so you can just have a longer go at this. So here we go with my example, followed by your turn. For those of you that like to go a bit deeper into things, you may have noticed in my example that I tend to lean on the third to the fifth, which is the B to the D for us on E flat instruments and the E to the G for B flat instruments. The reason for this is that it sounds cool, and the reason for that is that the particular interval created with these two notes, going between the third and fifth notes of this chord, is you create a minor third interval, and the minor third interval creates a bluesy sound. So if you highlight this particular sound or effect, colour, texture, then it sounds really good. So if you're trying to figure out how to create some light and shade with just these three notes, then have an experiment with that minor third interval in there, and then offset it with the other intervals that you can create with the chord notes. Okay, go on then. I wasn't going to go into all of the intervals on this, but here, this is what you can do. If you start on the first note of the chord and go up to the third, you create an interval of a major third. If you start on the first note and go up to the fifth, you create a perfect fifth interval. And if you start on the first note of the chord and go up the octave, then you create an interval of an octave. If you start on the third of the chord and go up to the fifth, we've already said that you're creating the interval of a minor third. But if you start on the third and go up to the root note, then you're creating the interval of a minor sixth. And if you start on the fifth note of the chord and you go up to the root note, then you're creating the interval of a perfect fourth. And then finally, if you start on the fifth and go up to the third, you're creating the interval of a major sixth. So you can see there's actually a whole array of sounds, effects, colours, textures, however you want to call it, that you can create just with these three notes. So maybe put the backing track on again and have another go, because there's an awful lot you can do with this, and it's worth spending some time experimenting and exploring the sounds that you can create. I was telling you about the information that the chord symbol tells you and what it means for us as saxophonists. After the specific chord notes, the second thing that a chord symbol is telling you, and this is really important for us as soloists, is it's telling you what scale the chord is taken from. And that's important because it means that as well as using those chord notes, you can also use the notes of the scale in your solo as well. And the chord notes will always sound the strongest, sound the best, but the scale notes create a different effect. And two good ways to think about using the full scale are, firstly, the additional notes that you can use from the scale create the sound of tension, and if you then land on one of the chord notes, that creates the resolution, or the sound of release, if you like. And this idea of tension and release is a really important concept to try and bring into your solos. So it's a really good thing to play around with, the idea of tension and release. And secondly, if you play up a run of notes using the scale, then you can create quite a fluid flowing sound. And again, it's another really nice technique that you can bring into your solos. So we've got tension and release, and we've got longer, more fluid flowing lines that you can play. But the best way to discover this is actually to just try playing it. So again, I'm going to put the backing track on, and I'm going to do a short demonstration of playing around with these two ideas. And then I'll leave the backing track running for a short while so you can have a go as well. But the best thing to do then is also, on the Saxophone Study site, use the backing track below the video to have an extended go at this as well. Something else I should tell you at this point is the scale that you've just been playing can actually also be called by a different name, and that name is the Ionian Mode. You may or may not have heard of modes before, and it can seem very confusing. But basically, if you hear someone refer to the G Ionian Mode or the C Ionian Mode, all that means is that you are playing the major scale starting on that note, so the G major scale or the C major scale. Thinking about intervals again for a minute, you saw with just the 3 chord notes we had a large array of intervals that you could play around with, but now that we're adding the rest of the scale, you've got a ton of different intervals that you could explore. And if I went through them all now, it would make this video ridiculously long. But if you're up for a challenge, then that's actually a really valuable exercise to try and work out what all those different intervals are. What I will just highlight for you now quickly is where the minor third intervals are, because as we've already said, they sound really bluesy and sound really cool. We know that going from the 3rd to the 5th within the scale creates a minor third interval. You can also do this by going from the 2nd to the 4th, and the 6th up to the root note above it, and then the 7th up to the 9th, which is basically just the 2nd note but up the octave. So 9 notes above the root note. When you try these out though, just remember that idea of tension and release. So it may be that you're playing around with a minor third interval, but the note you land on when doing that is a tension note, so not one of the chord notes. So you may want to resolve that phrase by then moving down to a chord note. You may not, of course, and therein lies the beauty of art, because what sounds good to you might be different to what sounds good to me. And if you're playing certain notes and you play them because you want to make that sound and it sounds good to you and that's why you're doing it, then it's good. Before we move on from this chord, the Tonic Triad, there's just 2 other quick ideas I'd like to try out. But if what we've done already is enough for you to kind of deal with and digest, that's absolutely fine. I'm just giving a couple of extra ideas for those of you that like to just take things a step further. We now know that you can use the chord's parent scale, the major scale in this case, and you can use that in your improvisation. But what I haven't mentioned is that hidden within this major scale is a hidden gem. It's the pentatonic scale. There's actually quite a lot of situations where just using a pentatonic scale in your improvisation can just sound a bit bland and a bit boring, but playing over a straight major triad chord is not one of them. And this scale gets used an awful lot in pop and soul type solos. For example, I've Had the Time of My Life from Dirty Dancing is just one example, but there's loads of examples where it gets used lots. So it does have its place, and this is it. The pentatonic scale, so it's created by playing the first, second, third, fifth and sixth notes of the major scale. So you've actually already been using these notes, but what makes it special, gives it its own particular character, is that collection of intervals together. And putting this pattern together creates a particularly cool sound. And again, the why is down to the intervals that are created by grouping these notes together. And yes, you've guessed it, there's a good smattering of minor third intervals in there. Play up and down this scale now just to get familiar with the notes and the fingering, and then have a listen to my example of me doing a bit of improvising only using this pentatonic scale, and then again have a go yourself afterwards. So I said there was two extra things I was going to tell you about before we move off the tonic triad. So the first thing was the pentatonic scale, which we just had a go at. And the second thing is this. Play the pentatonic scale, but also add in an additional note of the flattened third or the minor third. And this then creates the tonic major blues scale. Tonic because you're starting on the root note. And adding in this extra note, the minor third, this creates yet again another minor third interval, which sounds really cool. And again, we're going to explore this by playing. So have a play up and down the scale, and then listen to my example of doing a bit of improvising with the scale, and then have a go yourself. Before we finish the lesson today, I want to let you know about an extension that you can do to this major tonic triad. So more often than not, the types of chords we'll see will actually be 4-note chords rather than the basic 3-note triad. So to turn this tonic major triad into a 4-note chord, we're going to carry on up the scale in thirds. So you start on the root note, the 1, and then you've got the 3, the third, then the 5, the 5th, and then you add in the 7th. So the 7th note of the scale. And this creates the interval of a major 7th, because from the root note up to that 7th note of the major scale, that interval is a major 7th. So when the chord was just the tonic triad, it sounded like this. But now we've added in the 7th, the major 7th sounds like this. You can hear that the chord sounds quite similar, but by adding in that 7th note, we're creating a different texture or colour or effect. I'll tell you what this means for us as soloists, and then after that I'll explain a bit about this chord symbol for this new 4-note chord. So the parent scale for this chord remains the same. it's still from the root note's major scale. That hasn't changed. So we can still use that scale in our improvisation, the Ionian mode. But we now have an extra chord note, so this changes the dynamics slightly of the tension and release. Again, we'll explore this by playing, but before we do, I just want to tell you that the one note that really defines the sound of this chord is that major 7th note. It's this note that differentiates the chord from the basic triad. So in your solo, if you lean on or emphasise that note a bit, then you're really bringing out the colour texture effect of this particular type of chord. So I'm going to do an example now of me improvising using the 4 notes of the chord initially, and then I'll bring in the remaining notes of the scale to explore this idea of tension and release, also trying some more fluid flowing runs of notes, and then you have a go. And don't forget there's a longer backing track for this below the video on the Saxophone Studies site. Again, this symbol is a piece of code and it's telling us 3 things. The first thing, so the letter name, the C, is telling us to play the tonic triad, so the 1, 3 and the 5. The major 7th bit is telling us to play the 7th note of the scale, and so that creates the 4-note arpeggio. And then the third thing is that this chord symbol is telling you that it is chord 1 from a major scale. So that means in your solo you can actually play any of the notes from that scale, as we've already explored. So when you practice soloing over this particular chord, there's 3 things to think about in particular to experiment with in your soloing. So one is to experiment with this idea of tension and release. So using your chord notes and stepping off them to the other scale notes and back to the chord notes. Then try creating more fluid flowing runs of notes using the scale. And then the third idea is to explore the different intervals that you can create by moving around the different notes of the scale. And then there's one final step to try with this chord for those of you that want to go a bit deeper. Again, if this has already been enough, that's absolutely fine. This is for more advanced players who want to go a little bit deeper in. So when soloing over a major 7th chord, I wouldn't usually use a pentatonic scale, or the major blues scale actually, because with both of those scales you lose the major 7th note. And as we've already said, that note is one of the kind of key defining character sounds or characteristic sounds of this particular type of chord. However, if you want to highlight that major 7th sound and create something that sounds a bit bluesy, there is something that you can do. So if you start on the 3rd note of the chord, so for E flat instruments that's the B, for B flat instruments that's your E, and from there play up the notes of a minor blues scale. You'll see on the screen now I've written out those notes for you, and you'll see that the notes within this scale, they all exist within the parent scale of this chord except for one, and this additional note is actually the interval, it's the note, the flattened 5th within the minor blues scale. And this has a really bluesy sound. But within the context of the chord we're playing, this same note creates an interval of a flattened 7th or a minor 7th, which again sounds really bluesy. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, but why? That note's not in the parent scale, why use it? And the simple answer is because it sounds great. And this is where the people that believe in the rules of music and we disagree, because I don't believe there are rules. There's guidelines, and because they're guidelines and not rules, that means they're movable. And once again, this is where your artistic interpretation comes in. So playing the interval of a flattened seventh or minor seventh over a major seventh chord, it shouldn't work. It shouldn't work, but it can sound great. But just a note on the artistic intention again. If you play this note on purpose because you know what sound it's going to make, and you're playing it because you want to create that effect, whether it's for tension and release or whether it's whatever the reason, if you do that on purpose, then it's valid. So in the final demo from me this lesson, I'm going to play over this major seventh chord. Initially, I'll only use the chord notes. Then, after a while, I'll bring in the notes of the Ionian scale, the major scale, exploring the ideas we talked about, tension, release, fluidity. And then I'll bring in the notes of this minor blues scale starting on the third note of the chord. And when I've done all of that, pause the video, put the backing track on, and have a go at doing it yourself. So in this lesson, we've gone from having no knowledge about chords to understanding what a chord is, knowing what the tonic major triad is, knowing what its chord symbol is and what that means, knowing what notes to use to improvise over it, and how to go a bit further with the sound and make it sound a bit fruitier. Also, what the Ionian mode is, what a major seventh chord is, what the symbol is and what it means. Also, how to improvise to solo over that, and how to make that sound a bit fruitier as well. I don't know about you, but I'm going to go and lie down in a darkened room now. The final thing to say is that I've gone into a lot of detail today, and if some of it, or even most of it, if it's gone over your head, that's okay. Take the bits that you can and work at those. If all you do is use the backing track and try some improvising with the chord notes for the tonic triad, that's great, that's really good, that's a really good thing to practice. And you can make a good sounding solo just with these three notes, so you know it's genuinely fine. But do check back to this lesson at a later date and then see if you can just get a bit more information out and take your next step to start working at that as well. So thanks for listening. I really hope this has been useful. I hope you have fun practicing these ideas, and I'm sure some of you will have questions. I love questions, so please ask me questions. If you're still watching this on YouTube, click the link below, go over to Saxophone Studies. You can access the resources for free, and they're going to help you practice these ideas. So I'll say bye for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell icon on YouTube, and I'll see you next time.